So we left off with the kind of demise of the Han Dynasty. China's in a politically fragmented state. But if you recall, we talked about one thing that really kind of differentiates China from developments in Europe. When the Roman Empire fell apart, Europe never reunited, right? And now we have like quite a large number of nation states there. You could argue the European Union is kind of an attempt still in progress, right, for Europe to unite. And given the latest developments, it's not clear that it will succeed. China always eventually pulls itself back together again. So we pick up the story with the Northern Wei Dynasty, and this is where China, in the north at least, is beginning to unify again. This is between 386 534 that they're going to establish their authority, at least in the northern part of China. And by this time, the Han Dynasty is pretty much, kind of determined the template for rule, right? There's kind of the idea they represent proper Chinese rules. So this new dynasty is going to be modeled very much on the Han Dynasty, even though ethnically they're not entirely Han Chinese. So the political elite are of Sino-Turkic origin, Sino referring to the Chinese part, Turkic referring to the fact that you have people coming from outside of what originally constituted China, originally speaking a kind of Turkic language. And we've talked a number of times about Turkic people coming from Central Asia primarily. But in any event, they're pretty much going to, whatever their origin, embrace Chinese culture on the Han model. They do move the court south to Luoyang, but Chinese becomes the language of the court. They adopt Chinese dress and surnames. They do bring in a few elements of Turkic origin, but for the most part, embracing Chinese culture and forms of government. As far as the Turkic part, they do have a nomadic cavalry that is somewhat modeled on how the Turkic people fought. And they do impose a new land tax that might reflect some outside influence as a source of revenue for the state. So the Wei Dynasty will prove relatively short-lived. And then after that, things fall apart just for a little bit. But again, this is basically the mandate of heaven being passed from one dynasty to another. And so there's this kind of period where you have a number of different emperors, officials, and military commanders struggling for control. But eventually, a new dynasty emerges, the Sui Dynasty. Taking its name from Sui Wendi, the founder. He was a general of Chinese Turkic ancestry who came to power in 581. And this is kind of really the beginning of a kind of much longer lasting unification of China, again, beginning in the north, where he's able to restore the tax base and a centralized bureaucratic government. But he then goes on to conquer southern China. So this is kind of, on a much larger scale in terms of unification. Sui Wendi, proves to be a pretty effective ruler, and this is a very prosperous and peaceful period, marked by the construction of huge palaces, rebuilding of the Great Wall, expanding the Grand Canal that's linking the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And these canals actually are very important in the sense that they unify different economic regions, right? They allow for kind of the movement of people and goods on a much larger scale. In this case, allowing the North to access the wealth of central and southern China. And by the way, speaking of the Grand Canal, it's still there today, and it just is going to continue to be expanded over the centuries. And you can see a number of different images here. I wouldn't recommend swimming in it, highly polluted, but very effective as far as allowing for the movement of goods and people. Of course, today you have modern rail systems and so forth, but the canals are still used. And on this map, you can kind of see where the canals would actually be linking together different river systems. Now, the Sui dynasty actually proves short-lived, but you're not going to have this kind of long period of political fragmentation after them. It pretty much, almost immediately after Sui Wendi's death, his successor proves not to be particularly effective, the Emperor Yang, partly because he meddles too much in the affairs of Turkic tribes to the north, which kind of leads to conflict. but there are other problems as well. In any event, the court eventually becomes bankrupt, and this kind of leads to a rising discontent, and then a series of rebellions, partly also spurred on by some natural disasters like flooding and things of that nature. Um, so various military commanders then end up fighting for control, but again, this time it's going to be a pretty swift transition to the Tang Dynasty. And in some ways, historians have often argued that in many ways, the Sui Dynasty is kind of providing the foundation for the Tang Dynasty, very much the way the Qin Dynasty had provided the foundation for the Han, right? So where in both cases you have a very short-lived dynasty, but one that was able to effectively unite China, and then almost immediately being supplanted by another much longer lasting dynasty. In the case of the Qin by the Han Dynasty, in the case of the Sui by the Tang Dynasty, which claims to be related to the Sui through the Sui Empress. So the Tang Dynasty is going to be a much longer lasting dynasty. One of the first things they do is relocate the capital to Chang'an, and Chang'an will become a really, really important city during this period. And in the meantime, again, the transition proves to be fairly smooth. Within a decade, the Tang Dynasty is able to extend its authority over all of China, and even then to begin expanding beyond those borders. So, in many ways, even though it's a new dynasty, a lot of continuity even going back to the Han period. So, for instance, both Confucianism and Buddhism remain incredibly important. Certainly, with respect to the government bureaucracy, it is absolutely essential that you are a Confucian scholar. These are the individuals who will be employed at court. And during this period, Buddhism is in the form of temples and monasteries will flourish throughout the empire, right? So in this respect, a lot of continuity. And so, if you're just a regular Chinese peasant, kind of a feeling that not much has changed. And in fact, in terms of connection with the Han period, many government officials actually can trace their ancestry back to these very important aristocratic families from the Han period, right? So they had been kind of dominant back then. They continue to dominate Chinese society. And the bureaucracy is going to be a highly centralized one, with the emperor, of course, at the top of the pyramid. But again, continuity also in that many former Sui officials will just continue to govern, right? But you might recall we talked about one of the defining features of Chinese government throughout its history is a very large and well-developed bureaucracy, right? Meaning that the central government has very real direct control throughout its territory. Now, government during the Tang period is going to have a very specific kind of hierarchical organization. At the highest level, you will have three main organs of government responsible for different aspects of government. So you have military affairs, which obviously is responsible for all military-related issues. A council of state, which is the primary administrative unit for, basically any aspect of government not related to the military. But the third body is actually quite interesting, the censorate, right? So the censorate is actually responsible for making sure that government officials are behaving, of course, within its own body, but also within the Council of Military Affairs and Council of State. Now, military affairs is headed by the emperor almost directly. He's in effect the commander-in-chief. He supervises the army. And he is also, of course, at the top of the pyramid for the Council of State. Censorate watchdog, right? They also report directly to the emperor. Their responsibility is to inform him about any kind of corruption or illegitimate practice or even just poor government, right? What's really interesting, they even have the right to criticize the emperor himself. They can remonstrate, they can critique him, they can point out where they feel that he's behaving in an inappropriate manner, though of course they should probably do so in a very polite and delicate way. So in terms of actual practice, the Council of State would meet daily with the emperor, and there would be various heads of the secretariats who would draft policies in consultation with the emperor. These would then go to the chancellery, which would review them, and then to the state affairs that would actually carry them out. So, state affairs was kind of the point of exit as far as policy went, and it would go from there to 6 ministries, which constituted the core of government up through the 20th century, right? So, this is pretty much a structure that's going to remain in place right up until modern times. And then beneath the 6 ministries would be several levels of local government, right? So you had this kind of chain of transmission from the top down through state affairs from the highest level to the 6 ministries, which were kind of organized also geographically in terms of different regions of China. And from them, it would work its way down to local levels of government. Now, most Chinese during this period, as previously were peasants, what's interesting, all land was, in principle, the property of the emperor. So if you're a peasant, you're pretty much just borrowing land from him. Though, if you're among the aristocracy, you do, in effect, have, in many regards, the prerogatives of ownership in terms of how you manage your land. They had something called the equal field system. This had to do with how land was distributed to cultivators. So the kind of the idea was that every male cultivator should get an equal allotment of land. What is interesting, women could also be allocated property. They would receive less, but this is actually, in some ways, definitely progress as far as most parts of the world at this time, where women wouldn't have had the opportunity to own land at all. And the cultivators would have, the farmers or peasants would have to pay taxes in the form of either labor or grain. Again, aristocrats would have, in a sense, much larger landed estates. Even if technically belonging to the emperor, their control of it was confirmed, usually through the granting of titles that would have represented kind of different ranks or offices of government. And related to that, they would also have special exemptions in terms of taxation and so forth. And we should be clear about this. During the Tang period, aristocrats pretty much rule. They dominate the bureaucracy. They determine, in effect, who actually gets recruited, who gets appointed. So usually it's by recommendation. In theory, there is a kind of examination system. So you should be properly educated, and then you take exams, and then you work your way up. And that's supposedly how you should receive an appointment. In actual fact, it's really more about who you know, right? So appointments are made based on the recommendation of aristocrats. They still have the examination system in place, but only a small percentage of bureaucrats actually come through the examination system. And they certainly would have been held in high regard, right? I mean, the fact that you had actually gone through that system would be an indication that you were quite capable. But let's consider that even those who went through the examination system usually came from aristocratic families. Really, if you weren't the son of a well-to-do family, your family really couldn't afford to fund your education, to lose your labor for the years that you're studying that would be necessary to pass these rigorous examinations, right? So regardless of whether they went through the examination system or not, the vast majority of bureaucrats are definitely aristocrats. Now we should note that you do have examples of women governing, even becoming emperor. It's not something that would have happened that often. We already saw an example of that during the Han period with Empress Lu. In this case, it's going to be a woman named Wu Zhao. In some ways, she's a really fascinating individual, right? So she's an example of how a woman might work her way up from a pretty low level. She started out as a concubine, but she had incredible charisma and was able to charm her way to becoming empress. And so she became a very dominant figure in the court, very influential with the emperor, particularly after he suffered a stroke in the year 660. And then following his death in 683, she ruled as regent, and then later on deposed her own son, had him forced from the throne, and took the title of emperor herself. Right, so that's, it's not something that happened very often, but you can see how a woman might come to achieve power. One thing she did do is temporarily move the court to Luoyang, And she kind of proclaimed that this really marked the beginning of a new dynasty, though historically it's really kind of continuation of the Tang Dynasty. She was a really, really fervent Buddhist. She actually saw herself as an incarnation of the messianic Buddha Maitreya. The Buddha Maitreya kind of represents a particular sect of Buddhism that had developed that kind of believed that the Buddha would actually become reincarnated periodically over the course of history in order to provide guidance to Buddhists. So this is also kind of an example of Buddhism becoming much more like a religion. In any event, right? I mean, the fact that she even saw herself as constituting this individual is a strong indication of her support for Buddhism. Also evident in the fact that she built temples throughout the land, and she was a pretty effective ruler. During her rule, Tang military power would expand, more territory would be brought under Tang rule, and she would actually rule until she was 80, at which point she was deposed, forced to step down from the throne in 705. She also tried to initiate some reform to kind of, shake up things a bit with the bureaucracy in terms of the, not necessarily eliminating aristocratic control, but maybe getting other aristocrats involved from other regions in China. So it wasn't just that the government, particularly the central government, was dominated by aristocrats. It was actually becoming dominated by a limited number of families. So she brought in aristocrats from other regions in China. And she also did promote the examination system, that it should actually matter more instead of, just kind of these old northwestern Chinese aristocratic families just kind of promoting their own. So the people she brought in, they tended to reside in one particular part of the city near the North Gate. Later on, we'll look at kind of the basic outlay of Chang'an. You'll kind of see you have basically is kind of structured around four gates. So they became known as the scholars of the North Gate in connection with that. Now, she was followed by a fellow named Xuan Zong. Um, and so he's pretty much going to undo all the reforms that she did, right? So it's kind of going back to the way things used to work. He appointed government commissions, but these were headed by aristocrats. So this is pretty much like putting the fox in charge of the hen house as far as any kind of reform they might initiate. He weakened the examination system. Um, so, those from our point of view would seem to be kind of negative developments. On the other hand, he did repair the Grand Canal and extend it, and did initiate a new census, which really helped to kind of firm up the tax base. Like, he had a clear idea about, who should be paying taxes and how much, and this led to additional revenue. And this was definitely kind of a culturally brilliant period. You could argue that the Tang Dynasty really coming into its own at this point. And by this time, the capital of Chang'an, where the capital is kind of relocated back there, is probably the most incredible city in the world at this point, with the possible exception of Baghdad. When we look at developments with respect to Islamic civilization later, we'll kind of talk about that a bit. So Chang'an is just like this absolutely fabulous place. Part of it is like a lot of tax revenues actually spent on the city. Some of this is, simply this is the center of government, so it does cost a lot if you're going to have a large bureaucracy. But part of it is also there are very kind of strong ideas in Confucianism, as we've learned, if you recall the article we had by Fingeret, regarding the importance of ritual, presentation, and so forth. So there's kind of like, the idea that the palace, for instance, has to be situated at the far north of the city, facing south. The emperor should always be facing south when he's making pronouncements. The kind of environment within which government operates should be very prestigious and impressive. You might think of it this way too, that the palace in a sense is a kind of propaganda for the authority of the emperor. If somebody's going to visit the emperor, they should, there should be a kind of feeling of awe as you approach the emperor, as you get closer to him, as you enter the gates of the city, as you enter the gates of the palace, and you make your way to the inner court, right? What you see here are artistic depictions of the royal palace. Unfortunately, Chang'an, the original structures of the city no longer exist. and this is kind of a recreation of what it might have looked like. It would have been, first of all, the palace would have been, both the residency of the emperor, but also it would have housed a complex of government offices, right? And they would have been kind of to the forefront of the palace. I should say in the front of the palace there, not in front of the place. And so you would have approached the palace coming from the southern gate and then making your way down a 500-foot wide avenue. Just kind of like it would take quite a while for you to get to the actual palace, but you'd always see it in front of you. And it would have been a very kind of impressive kind of experience, right? Really impressing upon you the authority of the emperor. The city itself was quite large. It covered 30 square miles, and it was kind of a grid-like structure, right? So those of us coming from New York, this is a very familiar way to kind of structure a city in terms of the streets. And it would have been divided into 4 quadrants, each being enclosed by walls. So here you see kind of a city plan with the palace to the north, kind of grid-like structure with the, in terms of the streets. And again, it would have been divided into 4 quadrants. So, at this point in time, Chang'an is probably like the most fantastic city in the world, with, the possible exception of Baghdad, which again we're going to talk about later. Population of 1 million, which is pretty large for that time. And a lot of this, not, because it's not only an administrative center, it's also a very important center of trade. So an important economic center. It's at the terminus, the Chinese terminus of the Silk Road. So this is a point from which caravans would set out across Central Asia, and then to which they would return. Now markets are government controlled, and you have like special areas in the city that are designated for different kinds of commodities, but also for different merchants coming from different places. And you have merchants coming from as far away as India, Persia, Syria, and Asia. So the Tang Dynasty, during the period where the Tang were governing, China is surrounded by large numbers of people, many of whom they have good relations with, but who can also pose a threat. Very important from a pretty early point is going to be maintaining security on the Silk Road. And that kind of explains why you have this kind of very thin yellow section jutting out towards Central Asia, right? So, where you might want to maintain direct control rather than being dependent on the goodwill of other people. Now, in terms of who these people were, probably, the most the people who they had the most interaction with would have been people of Turkic background. So I wrote here the Turks, but just to be clear, we're not talking about people from the modern state of Turkey, which at this point doesn't even exist, right? I mean, Turkic people are only beginning to migrate into Anatolia, where modern-day Turkey is. So many of these Turkic people heavily influenced by Chinese culture, many of them acknowledging to some extent the overlordship of China, some of them establishing petty states, for instance, near Samarkand along the Silk Road. Between 711 and 736, the Turkic people were able to establish control pretty much from the steppes of Central Asia, around the Oxus River all the way to China's northern frontier. So again, I mean, relations could go either way. Most of the time they were pretty good. Most of the time these different Turkic states would acknowledge the overlordship of China as the Middle Kingdom. But sometimes it could be conflictual. Another very important growing power at this time is Tibet. And in fact, at one point, Tibetan forces are actually going to invade China and capture and loot the city of Chang'an in 763. And this is kind of interesting when we consider that Tibet today is part of China, is pretty much dominated by China. And sometimes we hear in the news about how the people of Tibet who don't necessarily consider themselves to be Chinese would rather have an independent state. Sometimes there's some questions about the nature of Chinese control in that regard and so forth. But at one time they were actually a pretty powerful kingdom that could even threaten China itself. Now, generally speaking, and this is kind of an old tactic, you might remember, the best strategy from the Chinese point of view is if you could form an alliance with nomads, particularly those closest to the frontier, even in some cases promoting them to get into conflict with tribes further afield, right? So these were mostly nomadic people, and again, very often they would try to promote one particular nomadic tribe over another, even allowing them to dominate other people. A good example of this is the Uyghur Turks, who, with Chinese help, were able to control much of Central Asia from 744 to 840. Uyghurs, by the way, another people that are currently under Chinese government, sometimes kind of promote the idea that they're not really Chinese and maybe should have their own state. They live in the far western part of China. So, that's a later development, but, you can see that from an early point they have relations with China. Now, the borders were defended by military commanders, and so this could sometimes prove another problem. These often would become very dominant in the outer provinces, and that could also prove a threat to the central government, to the Tang court, because they're kind of far from the center, and they have an army under their control, and it's not always clear to whom they're loyal. And here we see again the Great Wall of China, which, again, the wall wasn't. And by the way, China now has a lot of territory beyond the wall under its control, but it was never the intention that the wall should actually be, something like Game of Thrones, where it's just supposedly impossible to get through, right? It's more about, kind of facilitating the ability of the Chinese army and military commanders to move back and forth along the frontier, to garrison soldiers, and to have a pretty good view of what's going on. Now, during this period, many parts of Asia are going to come under Chinese influence as what we call tributary states, right? So often they might be conquered territories that aren't fully incorporated into the Tang Empire, right? So they become tributary states where, in effect, they have their own government, their own ruler, but they basically acknowledge the overlordship of what's come to be known by this time as the Middle Kingdom. So we have this happening in Central Asia and Tibet. But another really good example would be the states that emerge in Korea, such as Silla, and even Japan, right? So tributary states, right? Well, the term, comes from the idea that they provide tribute on a regular basis, right? So they would send embassies bearing gifts to the Tang court, again as a kind of sign of loyalty, but also providing revenue for the Tang court. And so, but it's kind of a two-way street. They are also benefiting from their connection to China, right? So this provides kind of access to Tang culture and technology. And over time, there develops the idea, for instance, in Korea and to some extent in Japan, that someone who's highly educated, a measure of that is, that they have become fluent in Chinese, in the language, in the culture, and so forth. And so it becomes a very prestigious thing, right? To be a student, for instance, sent to Chang'an to study. In 640, you have about 8,000 Korean students that are studying in Chang'an, right? Well, as eventually happens, decline sets in. No empire or dynasty lives forever. Around the mid 8th century, we start to see the frontiers of China beginning to contract. Neighboring people are beginning to prove much more of a threat, such as the tribes in Manchuria, but also in Tibet. And then at some point, we have a new power arriving on the scene, right? A new religion has emerged in the Middle East called Islam. And this provides a basis for the Arab people to create a vast empire. And at some point, they're even threatening China itself. And the decisive battle is going to be the Battle of the Talas River, which takes place in 751 near Samarkand. And the Arabs win, but they don't advance any further than that. And that kind of ends up marking the frontier between kind of, the territory that is pretty much being shaped by Chinese civilization and this kind of new developing Islamic civilization coming out of the Middle East. What it does do, however, is it does pretty much shut down the caravan trade on the Silk Road for the next 5 centuries, right? So this becomes kind of an insurmountable obstacle So in effect, kind of also cutting China off from other parts of the world. And here we see an artistic depiction of the Battle of the Talas River, a kind of Chinese depiction. And again, China loses. One factor, one factor in China's defeat might have been the ineffectiveness of the ruler at the time. We already met him, Xuan Zong, who supposedly, according to the stories, had fallen so deeply in love, become so infatuated with a young woman by the name of Yang Weifei that he just couldn't be bothered with any aspect of government. So he just became really ineffective. This will actually eventually lead to a rebellion. And here we see an artistic depiction of Xuan Zong with his consort. And this is, from what I've been told by some of my Chinese students, this has been the subject of many stories, films, TV series, and so forth. But in any event, people get fed up at some point, and this leads to a rebellion, the An Lushan Rebellion, which is headed up by a general by the name of An Lushan in command of 160,000 troops. And this culminates in the capture of Chang'an in 755. Now, this won't mark the definitive end of the Tang Dynasty. They're able to recover somewhat, partly with the help of the Uyghur Turks, who, for the reward for helping, get to loot Chang'an. But the new Tang Empire that emerges is much smaller. The frontier provinces are much less under central government control. And for the most part, we have a series of weak emperors. Occasionally a somewhat stronger emperor who tries to initiate some kind of reform. But it always proves to be too little, too late. And probably the biggest problem confronting this much smaller Tang Empire is that it has a much smaller population and therefore a much smaller tax base, right? So where before the rebellion, the Tang Dynasty governed over 53 million people, it now only has 17 million subjects. And that means, much fewer people paying taxes. And at some point, they try to get around, this problem by getting rid of the equal field system of taxation in 780 in favor of a new tax that is collected twice a year and thus much more onerous, right? Basically, they're trying to tax, they have fewer people, so they're trying to tax them more. And they eventually come up with a fixed quota of taxes for each province. The idea is basically, we call this tax farming. Aristocrats would be responsible for collecting that quota. And the incentive for them is if they collected whatever they collected over and above that quota, they would get to keep. And it's not too hard to see where this might lead, right? Aristocrats trying to collect even more taxes off the backs of peasants because then they can make a profit. So this is only over the long term making things worse. And at some point, the government is trying to monopolize salt and iron, so that could become an additional source of revenue. And that is also going to alienate people, including merchants. So, all of this, in an effort to bring in more revenue, really just speeding up the decline of the Tang Empire. And by the 880s, pretty much it has come to an end, with warlords carving up all of China into independent kingdoms. The Tang Dynasty finally falls in 907. But again, right, so the mandate of heaven is now being taken away from the Tang Dynasty, but eventually it will be given to another one. And within 50 years, a new dynasty will reunite China. So before moving on to the next dynasty, we might talk about some kind of more cultural developments during the Tang period. So first of all, Tang culture very cosmopolitan, particularly in connection with Silk Road trade. But remember, Silk Road is not like a single road, but also represents sea routes and many different land routes. So they're in really broad contact with many other cultures and people, particularly coming from India, but even from further afield. And they're very open to outside influences, particularly through Buddhism, right? But not only that. So, for instance, Indian painting and sculpture is very influential on how the Bodhisattva, right, this kind of supposed reincarnation of the Buddha, is represented in Tang representation. And you can kind of see, it's pretty clear looking at some of these images. On the one hand, that's depicting, in an ethnic sense, something Chinese, right? But there's also elements of Indian artistic influence there. And foreign influences are going to be evident in all kinds of ways, right? So remember again, right? You have certain quarters designated for foreign traders, not only in Chang'an but also in the seaports of southeastern China. So you have many Arab and Persian traders that are actually residing there, and they're bringing with them many of their own cultural and even religious influences. So we're going to see kind of the spread of not just Buddhism but also Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Later on, a lot of this will be purged from China, so that's why it's not going to have any kind of long-lasting influence until the present. But during the Tang period, other religions are completely tolerated. And we, see other kinds of influences as well. For instance, a lot of elements of what today we might identify as Chinese music actually came from Central Asia, including musical instruments that ended up displacing the native tradition. Uh, and like one really good example of the cosmopolitan nature of Tang society is, that you have hairstyles, right? Like meaning that, you kind of have ideas about, what is fashionable in terms of not just clothing, but also how you style your hair. That might change from one period to another. That's not something you find in the pre-modern world very often. Now, probably the biggest influence culturally and religiously during this period is Buddhism. Some would argue this is the golden age of Buddhism as far as its influence and reach in China. Buddhism is patronized by emperors, by aristocrats. So, Buddhist temples and monasteries end up becoming incredibly wealthy with large land holdings. And, they're very beautiful. Again, later on, many of these will be destroyed, and that's actually in some ways a very modern development, particularly if we're thinking of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s in connection with communism. So, unfortunately, we lost a lot of this, but they used to be really pervasive throughout China. A few did survive, so we have kind of an idea of how many others might have looked. Really good example is the caves of the Thousand Buddhas in China, which became sealed in the 11th century and to some degree forgotten, and that actually proved to be its salvation. Here you see kind of an external view of the entire complex, right? So it's kind of built into the side of a kind of small cliff behind which are caves. So you have these kind of more developed entryways. So Buddhism was very important in Tang society, particularly at the more local level, right? So you do have this really well-developed bureaucracy, and so central government has a lot of direct control over what happens at a more local level. But back then there were still many responsibilities locally that would have been handled, kind of on the ground. It wouldn't really have been the responsibility of the central government. So, for instance, central government would provide the kind of schools for Confucian education, in preparation for the examination systems. But if you had kind of more, schools that provided like a very rudimentary education for peasants or something like that, that might have been provided by a Buddhist temple, which might also provide inns and bathhouses for travelers. At a very local level, they might actually function almost as a bank, lending money. And very often, just kind of day-to-day necessities. If you needed a priest to perform a funeral or to provide some kind of basic medicines, it might be, you might go to a Buddhist temple or monastery for that. Now, there were moments when Buddhists were persecuted in China. It was very rare. I mean, most of the time they were really strongly supported. But I mean, given how wealthy they were, they provided the temptation to try and take control of that revenue. So, for instance, between 841 and 845, an emperor who happened to favor Taoism confiscated millions of acres of tax-exempt land and put monks and nuns back on the tax registers. Up until then, they had been exempt from paying taxes. And along the way, ended up destroying 4,600 monasteries and 40,000 shrines, right? So, you did have the exception where they might be persecuted. And again, probably the driving thing behind that wasn't, like some kind of fierce religious opposition to Buddhism or what it represented, but simply the fact that it would provide an incredible source of wealth. Now, we should note too that over this period, Buddhism is starting to evolve into a number of different sects, some of which really feel a great deal more like a religion. You might remember Buddhism in its founding. The Buddha, the original Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was simply a man who had, kind of figured out the secret to achieving nirvana, and then provided, you might even say, guidelines about how someone else might do the same. In that respect, almost more of a philosophy, even if, it incorporated many ideas related to Hindu cosmology. But over time, it's starting to feel a lot more like a religion. So, for instance, one sect focused on the Maitreya, which you might remember the Empress Zhao had claimed to be an incarnation of. The Maitreya is a kind of Buddhist cosmic messiah who would eventually create a paradise on earth, right? And this, really sounds much, very familiar for someone coming out of the Christian or Islamic faith. Another sect worshipped something called the Amitabha Buddha, Lord of the Western Paradise or Pure Land, who helped people achieve enlightenment. But the way they talked about enlightenment, it sounded more like salvation a la Christianity. And they even developed a congregational form of worship. This became the largest sect in China. Earlier on, probably the most common sect had been the Tiantai, which always had, it seemed, kind of a bit of a militant aspect to it. It often became the basis for peasants to organize militantly, and even thus became kind of a basis for starting rebellions. That might be why they were later suppressed by the government, because they were seen as a threat. But coming back to the sect related to Amitabha Buddha, I mean, even this idea that there's kind of like a Western paradise, I mean, that sounds a lot like, how Christians and Muslims and Jews think of heaven, the place you go to when you die and so forth. We should note, in kind of concluding this part of the lecture, that some Buddhists will rebel against this religiousizing of Buddhism, particularly in Japan, where they develop a form of Buddhism that we often refer to by the term Zen. Though this was also, it actually began in China and was very popular among the Chinese elite, but really took root in the end in Japan. This is kind of like, let's get back to basic principles here. Buddha was only a man who basically called upon people to attain enlightenment by their own effort, right? And so they kind of also developed a series of practices that would help one to do that, to obtain enlightenment through a regimen of physical labor and meditation. Probably the most famous aspect of Zen is that they would pose these unanswerable riddles as kind of part of this meditation, as a way of kind of jolting the mind from this kind of mundane reality, right? To look beyond what we see around us. So a good example, the way they would describe it would be that, trying to solve one of these riddles was like a mosquito biting an iron ball. The point being that these riddles were not meant to have answers, kind of the what is the sound of one hand clapping kind of riddle. So we'll pause there and pick up our discussion with a little bit more consideration of Tang cultural developments, and then moving on to the next dynasty, the Song.